In 1991, the Center for African Arts in New York City put on an exhibition called Africa Explores, 20th Century African Arts. Amongst the exhibit, which contained a mixture of traditional and contemporary art, were 2 black and white photographs the curator had found while traveling around West Africa in the 1970s. The author was unknown, and they were simply credited Anonymous Photographer, Bamako. While nobody could identify the photographer, when the art collector Jean Pagozzi came across the images, he was amazed at the work. Perfectly exposed and technically brilliant, the portraits were entrancing, capturing the spirit of their subjects against a patterned background that somehow both disguises and accentuates. He immediately asked the curator of his own collection, André Magnin, to travel to Bamako to find the mysterious photographer behind the work. A year later, in 1992, the creator of these images, Seydou Keïta, now retired and mostly spending his days working on motorcycles, was tracked down.
Ils sont venus dire qu'ils ont besoin de Seydou Keïta, le photographe. Ah, j'ai dit, vous demandez Seydou Keïta? J'ai dit oui. Il dit oui. J'ai dit c'est moi. Ah non, mais vous êtes mécanicien, Seydou. Vous êtes Seydou le mécanicien, mais nous voulons Seydou Keïta le photographe. J'ai dit, mais c'est moi.
He dug around his garage for a metal trunk where he had saved 7,000 negatives taken throughout his career and showed the astonished collector his work. Magnin returned to France soon after with 921 negatives and started making prints. The beginning of a new partnership was formed. The rest is history. A solo exhibition soon followed, and then many more, and soon the name of Seydou Keïta was known across the art world. Today he is remembered as the most famous African portraitist of the 20th century. Seydou Keïta was born around 1921 in Bamako, Mali, which at that point was still a French colony. His father was a carpenter, and the young Seydou seemed destined to follow a similar path, until he received his first camera, a Kodak Brownie, from an uncle. What began as a hobby quickly blossomed into something more, and in 1948 he opened his first photography studio in the courtyard of his family's compound.
Cela dépend de mon oncle qui était parti au Sénégal. À son retour du Sénégal, lui, il a amené un appareil 6-9 en boîte. Ah, moi, j'ai dit, pourtant, moi, j'aimerais avoir cet appareil-là. Il dit, d'accord, il y a la pellicule, tu prendrais ça aussi. C'est là que j'ai commencé à faire des photos.
Using his own bedsheet as a backdrop and a 13 by 18 view camera with a broken shutter, the intrepid young photographer would take pictures by removing the camera's lens cap when photographing and estimating the exact time needed in order to expose each photograph correctly.
Alors, il y avait des images, on dirait des squelettes que j'ai photographiés, puisque je ne connaissais pas comment il faut photographier avec l'appareil. Mais en fin de compte, je suis arrivé quand même à faire de jolis portraits.
In 1948, Bamako was enjoying a period of immense economic and demographic growth, which swept through the city in the years following World War II. Unlike photography in Mali up to that point, which had been taken by French colonists and was mainly anthropological in its nature, Keïta's photography instead focused on the individual and their aspirations. In this quickly modernizing society, his photography promised to immortalize his subjects within that modern world. Soon, Keïta was seeing up to 40 clients a day, and getting your portrait taken by Seydou Keïta quickly came to signify one's cosmopolitanism and cemented their place as a true Bamakois.
Oui, c'est les Européens, quand ils viennent, ce sont eux qui faisaient la photo un peu partout. Puisqu'à l'époque, nos grands personnages ne voulaient pas du tout se faire photographier. Par la religion avait interdit ça alors. Mais quand même, les jeunes ne voulaient pas écouter ça du tout. Hein? Ah oui, les jeunes se photographiaient.
Another feature of Seydou Keïta's photography was his use of different backgrounds and props in his images. a combination that made for not only striking compositions, but also gives us an intimate insight into the psyche of those living in Bamako at the time. Having used the sheets from his own bed for his first background, Keïta would soon use a combination of both plain and African patterned materials in his backdrops that he purchased from the local market. It is those adorned with the traditional West African designs that we associate most with his work today. Not only do they contribute to the visual energy of the photographs, but also tie each portrait back to both the region and its traditions. One final interesting aspect of Keïta's backgrounds is that although Keïta never kept a detailed record of when each of his images was taken, because he only changed his backdrops every couple of years, they now also serve as a marker of when each image was taken, serving to create a more accurate chronology of his work. The other big component of Keïta's portraits are the props. Most of these, European clothing, watches, radios, and even a car, were provided by the photographer himself. They not only represented modernity, but also helped his subjects to signify their prosperity, cosmopolitanism, and identity as the Bamakois they believed themselves to be. Such an aspirational quality is a key component of Keïta's work, contributing to the idealized style of his portraiture.
Je faisais de belles portraits à l'époque, puisque là j'avais vraiment compris ce que c'est la photo.
This is one of Seydou Keïta's most famous photographs and is a portrait of two high society Bamako ladies dressed in identical boubou robes that merge harmoniously with the backdrop behind them. The two women were in fact co-wives, married to the same man, and Keïta signifies this relationship through the careful positioning of their hands and arms. Known as the man with the flower, this photograph is often mistaken as a self-portrait. But in fact, the young man in the image is Mr. Sissoko, a young civil servant working for the colonial administration. Dressed in white and adorned with all the accoutrements a modern Bamakois man would own, he is the picture of modern Western elegance. The flower in his hand, symbolizing femininity, is the final touch, and was perhaps inspired by the famous French poet Stéphane Mallarmé, popular at the time. The Vespa, both a symbol of affluence and modernity, was one of the props Keïta made available to his clients. In this image, two young women show off their modern style by posing on it, inadvertently juxtaposed by the traditional mud brick of one of Bamako's Banco walls. While Western styles were first adopted by the men of Bamako, by the late 50s, the women of the city were following suit and beginning to dress accordingly.
Quand les clients viennent, une pause, on ne peut pas dépasser. On n'a jamais fait deux pauses pour quelqu'un, non. Puisque les films, on travaille pour avoir.
In their entirety, Seydou Keïta's photographs give us a unique look into Malinese society during a period of great transition, both from French colony to independent nation, as well as from a more traditional society into the modern world. In many respects, his images serve as a typology, and while Seydou Keïta knew nothing of August Sander, they are eerily similar to those the German took during the 1920s in Weimar Germany. In 1962, shortly after Mali gained its independence, Seydou Keïta was offered a job by the government to become its official photographer and eventually closed down his studio business. Here he worked for the next 14 years, up to his retirement in 1977. As a result, Keïta lived in relative obscurity until his discovery in the West during the 1990s. In fact, it was only after his discovery by Jean Pagozzi and André Magnin that he ever became known in the Western world at all. But known he became. Keïta's first solo exhibition was held at the Fondation Cartier in 1994, and many more quickly followed. At the MoMA in San Francisco, and private gallery exhibitions in LA and New York. Keïta was even brought out of retirement by Harper's Bazaar, who he did a fashion shoot for in 1998. Seydou Keïta died in 2001 in Paris. Behind him, he left an impressive legacy, not just in the form of 7,000 negatives, but an indelible impact on African photography. He is widely regarded as not just the most famous African portraitist of the 20th century, but amongst photographers like Richard Avedon for his influence on the medium.